we're recording a little unplanned episode today. Obviously, some really just heartbreaking news. Not news that came sort of, I suppose, as a surprise in one sense. We know he's been sick, and it actually sort of just around Christmas there was worries that we were going to reach this point when his mum flew from Italy to England and then came back. But Gianluca Vialli passed away today on Friday, and it felt appropriate to get together and just talk about our memories of him. It's obviously just crushingly sad. First and foremost, he's a young man, 58 years old, who seemed to have so much life left in him, really sort of all the way to the end in terms of his character, his outlook, the way he was. Obviously an exceptional footballer, but Mina, I think sort of when these things happen, for me at least, the first thing I think about is not the footballer, it's the person. And I know you actually sort of knew Gianluca from a really young age to some degree because you lived nearby to him.
Yeah, it's bizarre because obviously he's a footballer and that's who he is. But when I was younger, I grew up in a household with sisters and not much football like obsessions, just World Cup obsessions. And but I used to sit down every Saturday morning and watch the show on Channel 4 called Gazzetta. I think that was what it was called. It was for Football Italia because they were following
Italia, yeah.
Following Gascoigne's journey, obviously, to Serie A. And during that time, I was a Lazio fan. I actually hated everything to do with Juventus. How interesting how things change, right? Anyway, the one redeeming factor that I did find about Juventus was that they had a player called Gianluca Vialli. And when he moved to England, I was lucky enough to be a neighbour. I lived in the same area as him. And back then, London just felt more like a village than it did now. Like now it's just this big city and like so many restaurants and so many places to go, and it's so like I don't know, just big and intimidating. But when we were younger, there was like 5 restaurants. I actually don't even remember more than 5. Obviously, when you're a kid, you probably go to the same ones that your family take you to. Yeah, that probably is. But but I just don't remember there being like Peruvian restaurants and German. It was just kind of like, your Italian restaurants and, I don't know. And you're a kid, right? So you go to the same ones. And anyway, one of our favorites was called San Lorenzo. And it was in Knightsbridge. And basically, he would always be there. He loved that restaurant. And at the time, I had my birthdays there. My best friend had all her birthdays there. We were just constantly there. And my best friend had some ties with either they were her godparents. I don't remember at the time with San Lorenzo. And Vialli was always there. And I kind of just hover around his table until he acknowledged me. Because obviously I was just like a kid. But you have to know that even when I was 12 at the time or 14, I don't remember how old I was actually at the time. I sort of still looked like I was 7. I didn't hit puberty till about 25, so I kind of looked like a kid. I kind of looked like it for a really long time, and I would just sort of hover around his table until he would say hello eventually, and I kind of just wanted to like. Again, this is so weird. It was a different time back then. I would just want to sit on his lap and tell him stories, about all the things I'd watched on Gazzetta and how much like I was obsessed with him and how I think he's going to be so brilliant at Chelsea. And like if he could say hello to Roberto Di Matteo and then Pierluigi Castoraghi and all these just other players that I really, really loved as well. And he used to just always like talk to me. He was always so nice to me. He was always so really, really lovely. And this would probably be about a weekly occurrence, to be honest with you. And then, like many years later, I was walking down Elizabeth Street, which was also in the same area because he always lived in Chelsea. And I was walking head down like a proper Londoner. London was now the city that it is, like scary and big and all of that. And, you're just trying to get to everywhere you want to be. And I literally just stopped dead in my tracks because I saw him. And I looked up and I was like, Vialli. And then he was like, and then he just started laughing and I was like, I don't know if you remember me, but I was like telling him this whole thing, and I finally got my chance to like sit with him and tell him all my stories about like how I was obsessed with him growing up and how I was a Lazio fan, and then I became a Juve fan with Del Piero's back heel and everything, and he just listened and took photos with me, and I loved him, you know. So I don't have a big story as a football journalist that sat down with him. And no, I kind of always knew him as just somebody who lived in the area that I was like madly obsessed with. And it was weird because I don't have anything with, I don't ever really remember like Gianfranco Zola, who was at the same period and obviously one of the very best in the Premier League, and all the players from Italy who came over to Chelsea. But Vialli was the one that I always saw. Vialli was the one that I always knew. Vialli was the one that I was obsessed with.
Yeah, I mean, he's very sort of in that sort of cultural moment of Italian footballers coming to Chelsea. He was very influential and sort of centralized. Funny you mentioned that restaurant San Lorenzo. I have also been there, and I think there's even a dish named after him there. I think there's and not just now all of a sudden. I think for years he had his own sort of spaghetti dish on the menu there. I can't remember if that was actually on the menu or if it was informal. Well, there weren't many restaurants that I think Italians moving to London considered worthy of being considered an Italian restaurant back then. You know, we had a lot of Pizza Express and places like that.
Yeah,
but
that's true.
You know, a proper Italian moving from Italy who wanted to get food that reminded them of back home. For my dad, that was one of the places in London as well. I think sorry, 1 second. I think sort of what you're sort of saying in that story really just speaks to so much of the character that he was, the sort of the overriding sense that I think I've always had from Vialli. And you know, I should say, actually, I never had a big sit down interview with him in my career. I wish I had. He's someone I would have loved to have that with. I got to interact with him in a few different situations in briefer ways, but I never got to have that big, long interview that would have been fascinating. But some others have done very, very well. I can point people in the direction if they want to see some great sort of discussions with him. Obviously, Gabriele Marcotti, our former colleague from ESPN, knew him very well and wrote 2 books with him, both of which are absolutely worth your time to go and have a read. But I think he was one of those people who always came across as having that perspective beyond football, of not just being sort of I don't know how to put it, not just sort of being someone who was interesting and compelling because they were a footballer. He was a compelling person because he was a compelling person, because he had that warmth to him, because he would sit down with, I suppose, Mina, a 7-year-old girl he didn't know, and listen to them and talk to them and share that warmth. And you know, I mean, this is a quote that is in my piece that I've written for The Guardian today about him, and it again, not mine. This is, if you want to know more about him, Alessandro Catalan did this interview with him for Netflix last year in Italy. Well worth anyone checking out. But he talked about this sort of his relationship with cancer and how it's changed his view on the world. And he said this phrase that I just found really sort of powerful, about recognizing he has less time to be an example to his daughters. And he said, you know, he thinks that setting an example, your children follow your example more than they follow what you say to them. And he said, I try to teach them that happiness depends on the perspective with which you look on life. You shouldn't put on airs. You should listen more and speak less. Laugh often. Help others. That's the secret of happiness. And I just think he embodied it, actually. I think that's not just words. I think that was the example that he set. He did have that great big grin, that laughter, that immediate warmth in his character that I think endeared him to people right away, and spoke to something bigger than just football. And God, I don't know where to start with the football side of things, Mina. I think we should talk about it, because not everyone listening to this will know the sort of full story of his football journey. I was thinking, funnily enough, my first memory of him, you talked about meeting him as a kid. My first memory of him was also as a kid, although I didn't get it in person. We had a VHS tape, my brother and I, of I think it was Arsenal's 1991-92 season, which wasn't even a remarkable season. They just put out end of season videos. And in the beginning of it, there's a pre-season tournament in which Arsenal played Sampdoria. It was the Makita Cup. And Vialli scores this astonishing scissors kick, and it's a pre-season game, right? Like, it's not a big important game. It's not a game that matters to anyone, but it was such a like piece of skill that, like, being little and watching football, I was still quite new to watching football, but watching football in England, I felt like I'd never seen anything like this. I'd never seen someone do what he did, where he jumped up in the air and did this extraordinary scissor kick. And so in my head, it was like, this is Italian football. This is different. This is like, I knew Italy were good because, of course, I watched the World Cup in 1990, but that's not the football that you see in England. And he was that, right? Like, he scored several overhead kicks in his career. He scored all sorts of audacious goals, but he also just scored, winners in European Cup finals, and he was such a sort of fundamental figure for Sampdoria, along with Roberto Mancini, which, of course, their relationship became something important even for Italy in the end. But they won the Scudetto together at Sampdoria, which is extraordinary. It's not something that happens in Italy, that a club like Sampdoria gets to win the league. They also won the Cup Winners' Cup with, as I said, Vialli scoring the 2 goals in the final. He was a brilliant footballer for Sampdoria. He then went to Juventus and continued that. And he then went to Chelsea and had that chapter as player manager, which is again sort of wildly successful in its short way. And I think it was, going on trophy count, the most successful of the pre-Roman Abramovich era, where they won the League Cup, the Cup Winners' Cup, the UEFA Super Cup, and the FA Cup in like 2 years. So he was a brilliant talent on the pitch. I don't know if you have particular memories of his Juventus time, Mina, that call to you particularly.
It's interesting because I always sort of think of Juventus at that time as being Ravanelli and Vialli. Those are the 2 like images that I remember. Obviously, Del Piero came a little bit after that, and I always couldn't understand why these men that were so young looked like they were so old. That was always the image I had of them. Him and Ravanelli always looked like old men before they were honestly old. But when I bumped into him in the street and I was telling him all these stories, I said, one of the factors why Juventus really became something I really loved was a large portion to do with Gaetano Scirea. And you sort of just looked at me, he's like, how old are you? Because I'm sitting there talking about Gaetano Scirea. And I was like, no, I never watched him. I didn't know, but it was just kind of like stories that you read about, like about what he stood for, Stile Juve, like just that kind of like a certain elegance and humanity in a player that he really stood out for. And I kind of felt like Vialli was just that man as well. He was the last captain to lift the Champions League trophy. He had just this astonishing career. I mean, we've never, as long as I've been a Juventus fan, seen Juve win the Champions League. So I've been to so many finals that I've started to think I'm a curse. I don't know how to explain. Like, maybe it's my fault that we're not winning it. Maybe I shouldn't show up, but
Not sure that's how it works.
Yeah, talk about making it all about yourself. But it's I did start to think like, this is just a really unlucky team. Like, I just don't understand why it's just like countless finals, countless losses. And he was, of course, the last captain to hoist that trophy above his shoulders. It's interesting when you saw him. I remember an overhead back kick when he was at Sampdoria, but I don't remember the team that he played that against. But it was like a huge tournament. I don't remember whether it was the Champions League. It's kind of like a little bit,
one.
Yeah, several, but this one in particular stands in my head. And I did a show with Roberto Di Matteo about 3 weeks ago, and it was for Premier League TV, where we discussed the best Italians to have ever graced the Premier League. And they had so many names on there, Benito Carbone and Carlo Cudicini, and obviously Roberto Di Matteo, Gianfranco Zola. And they didn't have Gianluca Vialli. And I was like, how are you not going to mention Gianluca Vialli? And they were like, well, we didn't really see the best of him in the Premier League. And I was like, it's interesting you say that, because I'd never heard of a player manager when I was a kid. I didn't really, I guess my family watched football as a source of entertainment, not people that knew a lot about the sport or could tell me things, you know. So I was self-taught, if you want. And the first example I ever knew of a player manager, maybe because he is Italian, was Gianluca Vialli. You know, that's what I felt like. Obviously there were lots of them back then. I didn't understand that at the time, but he was my first memory of that. And I remember thinking, how can you talk about like a man who lifted the trophy? I mean, it doesn't really matter what he did. He was Chelsea, like he was the face of Chelsea, you know, for a long time. That's how I felt about him, because of who he was. Because, and even he said, I was in one of his last interviews, he said, I was very lucky because I played with Roberto Mancini, Roberto Baggio, Alessandro Del Piero, and Gianfranco Zola, the 4 best number 10s. He said I was, at the time, he does mention Totti, but he said he was too young to have played with him at the time. And those were 5 of the best 10s that we saw during, at least, you know, my childhood, the best number 10s, and he got to play with 4 of them. And I always think of that relationship between Di Matteo and Zola and Vialli, you know, just bringing it all together and making it the best. It's weird that a lot of my memories of him have a lot to do with who he was as a person more than he was as a player. You know, it's not the trophies that I think of, or the fact that he was a complete forward. He could be a false number 9. He could, apologies, I didn't know that was on. He could score goals. He could play on the wing. He was just this complete player. But back then it seemed to me like everyone was a complete player.
Yeah, there's probably different parts there, aren't there? Part of that is like how we sort of have our impression as football as kids, or we don't know everything about it, and so everything feels different. And part of it, I think, is sort of genuinely like just the legacy of Gianluca Vialli is the reason it feels like, to me, the outpouring of grief today is even more sort of powerful than it has been for sort of other players who you could talk about being comparable in talent to him, because I think that it was part of it, is because he did spread that warmth and that sort of humanity with him. Because look, he was an extraordinary footballer. Like I don't want to miss that for people, and and for those who weren't aware, you know, he scored a lot of goals. He scored 19 goals in the 1990-91 season for Sampdoria. He scored 17 in 30 games for Juventus in 94-95. This is Serie A at its peak, by the way. This is Serie A in the 90s, when it was the hardest place to win in the world, the hardest place to score goals in the world. You know, this was really like special to score. Yeah, to do those things. And yet I'm the same as you, Mina. I don't think that it doesn't feel like that's what I'm grieving. You know, what I'm grieving is a person who just had this sort of way of being. You know, when I was writing the sort of obituary piece for The Guardian, I came across this phrase from when he was still at Sampdoria and at 22 years old, and Milan were trying to sign him, and he's, you know, again, this is in my Guardian tribute, so sorry if I'm repeating it to people who've read it already, but you know, he said, you know, at 22 years old, he's saying, at a big club, you are above all a number in service to the result. Right now, I'm more interested in being a person. And that's the thing, like that's the meat of it for me with Vialli. Like, he was always so human in some way. And I do think that part of that owes something to the relationship he had with Mancini. I think the two of them clearly found kindred spirits in each other. They were gemelli dei gol, the goal twins in Samp, and the fact that they came together again at what turned out to be very close to the end of Gianluca's life, to go and win the Euros together, to right some wrongs for both of them in some way, because they lost a European Cup final together at Wembley at Sampdoria, so they got to win a final at Wembley together. They got to have the national team success that perhaps they missed out on as players. Vialli was sort of started the 1990 World Cup and lost his place to Baggio along the way, and did play again in the semi-final, but perhaps didn't get to have the World Cup he wanted to right at the point in his career when you thought he would. But I do feel like their sort of story together shaped both of them so much as people. And, you know, as an Italian, this is the bit probably where I start getting choked up, where I think about it a lot, is just that Euros win. It really felt like something being shared by those two as people and their players as people who got to share it. I mean, Vialli was there as a head of delegation, which is this sort of slightly ambiguous role where you're an ambassador and you're doing a bit of sort of shaking hands and meeting people, but part of it is just sort of being helpful and being a father figure to the team. But I really felt like, and this calls back a bit to one of the things we talked about during the World Cup podcast, Mina, when we talked about the Morocco team and the mothers there. I think that there was something so universal about that story with Mancini and Vialli, that thing of, you know what, when you're doing something that you love with your best friend and it's just fun. That was what I felt during that Euros. That was what sort of touched me the most, I think. And yeah, I suppose, as awful as it is that this sort of wonderful man has lost his life at 58 years old, at least he did sort of, he never liked to talk about it as a battle. He always said he was walking with a travel companion, an unwanted travel companion in cancer, but at least they were able to walk that walk long enough that he got to have that be one of his last piece of his legacy as well. I'm sorry, Mina, I'm starting to cry, and I think I'm making you cry as well, and I'm sorry. It's just going to be that sort of show. Sorry, everyone listening. It's hard to talk about things sometimes.
It sounds so. I don't want to just focus on the fact that he was this. During the Euro 2020, it was like all you love in sport is that you identify with things.
Mm.
It's kind of like why we loved Morocco and the mums. It's just so human, right? You love that. And in Euro 2020, I couldn't bear to watch the penalties, and neither could he. So you felt like he was like with his turning his back because he just couldn't.
Sorry, don't know how this will come across as a recording. It's quite difficult for both of us at the moment. We're just sort of we're sad. And
yeah, when they lost
the
Champions League, it wasn't called that. Was it called? I don't even remember. Yeah, thank you. And he said that afterwards that people said, "Oh, it's not really manly to cry," and he's like, "Well, we sort of waited for everyone to go, and then me and Roberto Mancini just really like let it all go and just started crying for hours, And it was a time when football was very much like, even back then, even the 80s and 90s, and not that long ago, football was very like almost toxic masculinity, And in between that, you had him always talk about his feelings. He was always very open about what mattered and what was emotional. And he used to say, when I was younger and I would wear the earring and dye my hair, I just wanted to live. I was young, I was winning, I wanted to live outside of the box. And then it was different when I would have kids and I got married, and then I'd have to be this responsible man. And he really was, like, everything was about how he was going to be better, how he was going to write letters that would last with his two daughters. And everything he spoke of sounded like poetry, like one thing he said with Juventus is you have to train as if you've never won a game, and you have to play as if you've never lost one. And everything he said just came across as a poem, yeah, it's just, I just feel like every day I'm on Twitter writing about someone losing, like dying. And it's, I never knew Pele, and I understand that there's just been so many legends, but even if it's Grant Wall, even if it just kind of just feels like it's been a lot, and
it does
not been a really great time for the football community.
No, I really feel that as well. And obviously we lost Denise Mihailovic as well.
Exactly.
Someone who I suppose to lots of people has a more complicated legacy, and that's a different conversation for a different day, but who again certainly touched lots of people's lives and left a mark on them. It is sad and it's awful, and unfortunately this is part of life, isn't it? Cancer is a thing that I think hits lots of us in our lives. Maybe that's also one of the things that makes it hard and difficult to talk about when these things happen, is because I have people in my life who've been lost to cancer, and I know lots of other people will in their lives as well. And so you're not just thinking about one
That's
person
what
all the
it
time.
is.
You think about all the people who you've known.
You think about everything that's going on about your childhood, you know, your moments you had, and you just sort of ended up being, you know, weirdly upset about everything. I mean, even the hospital, Royal Marsden, you know, it's just. I remember once looking at a small flat with my partner at the time, and we wanted to buy one around there. And I was like, I just can't be next to the cancer hospital. It's just, I just felt like it was such bad juju. And anyway, if you go past it now, there's lots of flowers. But yeah.
I'm not entirely sure how to wrap this one up, Mina. I sort of want to bring everyone to a sort of happy memory that they can think about when they hold Vialli. I think I've already sort of probably said the one that I'm going to hold for him forever will be the Euros. It will forever. It's going to be his and Mancini's Euros in my mind. Even though, you know, he wasn't the manager, he wasn't the one there. He was sort of he was just as much a part of it. And I think that sort of stupid joke they got into, which they kept doing, where because he nearly missed the bus for the first game, after that every single game they'd pretend to do the bus without him. And it was sort of ridiculous because he's there and like off we go on the bus and we all know we're not actually going to go. But I think that's probably going to end up being one of my most enduring images of him. I think it's that and maybe the story, which I almost still can't believe it's true. But that when he got the player manager's job at Chelsea before his first game in charge against Arsenal, and Chelsea won, by the way, he gave all of the players a glass of champagne in the changing room before kickoff. He was like, I've got this job.
That's how you do
champagne
it.
for everyone. And I think, you know, characters that maybe we'll never see in football again like that, things that you wouldn't get away with in 2022 as a manager. But he had the, I don't know, he had the character to pull it off, I guess.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to end it. Our thoughts and prayers, obviously, with his wife and his 2 daughters at the moment, his family. Our condolences to the whole Gianluca Vialli family. I think that's probably where we should leave it. I'm sorry that it got emotional. It's very difficult sometimes to talk about certain players, certain memories that we hold of them, and I know that there's a lot that I'm supposed to tell you, which I've probably forgotten all. Thank you so much to those who have subscribed to this, and this is obviously a free-to-air episode. And we will be back on Monday or Tuesday to review everything. Is it Tuesday? It's Tuesday. To review everything that happened at Serie A over the weekend. Thank you for listening.
Obviously, for me, it's very important to be the last captain of Juventus to have lifted the Champions League, because all the fans still remember that. I still remember that, and they see me as the last captain of a very successful side in Europe, Italian side in Europe. So, on the one hand, I want Juventus to win, because I've got so many friends there. But on the other hand, it would be a bit annoying to see that someone is taking my place. Having said that, to have my picture lifting the cup next to Gaetano Scirea, a legendary Juventus defender, probably one of the best Italian defender of all time, and Gianluigi Buffon, it would be like, you know, having your painting hanging between a Picasso and a Van Gogh. So it would make my picture look better. And better, you know, on my side, I've got Buffon, because if it's not Buffon this year, it might be Chiellini in 2-3 years' time, and I'd rather Buffon to be next to me.
Serie A Chronicles is a Serie A Chronicles production.